By the 1820s, the center of American slavery was beginning to move, and the movement was not subtle. Entire landscapes were being transformed as cotton plantations pushed westward across lands that had only recently been seized from native nations. Forests in Alabama, Mississippi, and Louisiana fell under axes. Riverbanks filled with new cotton gins. Small settlements swelled into plantation districts, connected by muddy roads and steamboat routes that carried bales of cotton toward the Gulf of Mexico. But none of this expansion could function without labor, and the scale of labor required was immense. Cotton was not simply another crop. It became the foundation of an international industrial system. Textile mills in Britain devoured raw cotton. Northern factories in the United States spun and wove it into cloth. Global markets expanded around it. By the 1830s, cotton had become the most valuable export produced by the United States. Its profitability reshaped the South and tethered American agriculture directly to global demand. This explosive growth created a problem for plantation owners. Land was abundant, but labor had limits. With the transatlantic slave trade closed, plantation expansion could not rely on continuous overseas imports. The workforce needed to come from within the country. The solution emerged through an internal redistribution of enslaved people that became one of the largest forced migrations in American history. In the older plantation states of the Upper South, particularly Virginia and Maryland, agricultural patterns were shifting. Tobacco cultivation had depleted soils in many regions and no longer produced the profits it once had. At the same time, cotton plantations in the Deep South were desperate for workers. A market formed between these two regions, and enslaved people themselves became the commodity that connected them. Professional slave traders stepped into this space and built an industry around it. Men like Isaac Franklin and John Armfield organized vast trading operations that purchased enslaved people in the Upper South and transported them hundreds of miles southward. Their networks extended through cities like Richmond, Alexandria, and Baltimore, feeding the demand emerging in places like Natchez and New Orleans. Traders advertised openly in newspapers, announcing auctions of men described as prime field hands, or women described as likely, language that compressed entire human lives into brief commercial categories. Movement happened in multiple ways. Some enslaved people were marched south in chained groups known as coffles, sometimes walking hundreds of miles through unfamiliar terrain. Others were shipped along coastal routes on vessels, carrying human cargo from the Chesapeake to the Gulf. The journeys were brutal, not only physically, but emotionally. Families were separated with devastating regularity. Husbands sold away from wives. Children taken from parents. Letters and testimony recorded decades later describe the fear of being sold south as one of the deepest terrors within enslaved communities. Historians estimate that between 1790 and 1860, more than 1 million enslaved people were relocated through this domestic slave trade. Entire populations shifted across the American map. Virginia, once a center of plantation production, increasingly became a major exporter of enslaved labor. Mississippi and Louisiana became centers of cotton wealth powered by that labor. Cities like New Orleans grew into massive slave markets, where traders, buyers, and financiers converged. Behind the auctions stood a financial system that increasingly treated enslaved people as mobile capital. Banks issued loans secured against enslaved property. Planters used enslaved people as collateral to finance land purchases. Mortgages bundled enslaved laborers alongside acreage and equipment. The economic logic of slavery reached beyond the plantation itself and into the broader architecture of American finance. What made this system particularly durable was how seamlessly it connected internal migration with demographic growth. The domestic slave trade redistributed labor geographically, while births within enslaved communities replenished and expanded the population. The two forces reinforced one another. As plantations expanded deeper into the South, traders could supply workers from older states. As enslaved families grew, children born into slavery would eventually enter the labor system themselves or be sold into new markets. By the 1840s, the transformation was visible across the landscape. Cotton plantations stretched across thousands of acres. River ports shipped millions of pounds of cotton annually. Slave markets operated with bureaucratic efficiency. Ledgers recorded purchases and sales with meticulous precision. What had begun as a forced migration had evolved into a national labor market structured around human property. And within that market, every birth, every sale, every relocation reinforced a system that was growing larger with each passing decade. By the time cotton plantations dominated the Deep South, the machinery of slavery had become something far more structured than scattered plantations and occasional auctions. It had developed into a system that tracked human lives with the same bureaucratic precision used to track crops, livestock, and land. On plantations across the South, Overseers and owners maintained ledgers that recorded not only harvest yields and labor assignments, but births, ages, and family connections among the enslaved population. These records were not sentimental documents of family history. They were instruments of accounting. The legal structure behind this accounting had been in place for centuries. Under the doctrine known as partus sequitur ventrum, the status of a child followed the status of the mother. If the mother was enslaved, the child entered the world already classified as property. This rule, first codified in colonial slave law during the 17th century, remained firmly embedded in American law by the 19th century. It meant that the system of slavery did not require new contracts, purchases, or negotiations to expand its workforce. Birth alone was enough. Plantation records show how carefully this process was monitored. In many ledgers, enslaved women appear alongside notes about their age, health, and number of children. Infants were recorded almost immediately after birth. Probate inventories, documents used to divide property after a slaveholder's death, listed enslaved children with assigned monetary values. Sometimes toddlers were recorded beside plows, mules, and tools as part of an estate's total wealth. These documents reveal how deeply the economics of slavery were intertwined with reproduction. Slaveholders understood that the future labor supply of their plantations depended not only on purchases from traders, but also on the growth of the enslaved population already under their control. A child born on a plantation would eventually become a field laborer, a domestic worker, or a skilled craftsman whose labor could generate profit for decades. That future value was often calculated years in advance. The system did not operate through a centralized government policy dictating reproduction. Instead, the structure of property law created a powerful economic incentive. Every child born into slavery increased the wealth of the person who legally owned the mother. Over time, the accumulation of these births reshaped the demographic landscape of the United States. By the middle of the 19th century, this pattern had produced a striking result. The enslaved population had grown from roughly 700,000 people in 1790 to nearly 4 million by 1860. Unlike earlier centuries when the Atlantic slave trade supplied large numbers of enslaved Africans, this expansion occurred primarily through births within the enslaved population itself. But behind these numbers were lives shaped by constant uncertainty. Enslaved families formed bonds and communities despite the conditions imposed on them. Parents raised children within a system that denied their legal authority over those children. Marriages were not recognized in law, meaning spouses could be separated through sale at any moment. The threat of separation hovered over family life continuously. Formerly enslaved people who later gave testimony described the emotional complexity of this world. Birth could bring joy and hope, but it also carried fear. The knowledge that a child might one day be sold away or forced into labor before adulthood. The family unit existed within a structure that treated its members as assets that could be transferred, mortgaged, or inherited. This tension between human life and economic calculation defined the internal mechanics of slavery in the 19th century United States. Plantation economies depended on expanding labor forces. Domestic slave markets redistributed that labor across regions, and the legal framework ensured that every generation born into slavery reinforced the next. The result was a system that no longer depended on ships arriving from across the Atlantic. It had learned to reproduce itself within the borders of the nation, and as the numbers continued to grow, so did the political stakes surrounding it. By the 1850s, the scale of what had developed inside the United States was impossible to ignore. What had begun as an agricultural labor system tied to colonial plantations had expanded into something far larger, a national economic structure in which millions of people were legally classified as property and integrated into the financial and political life of the country. Cotton plantations stretched across the deep South from Georgia to Texas. Slave markets operated openly in major cities. Banks, merchants, shipping companies, and textile mills all participated, directly or indirectly, in the profits generated by enslaved labor. The numbers themselves told part of the story. In 1800, the enslaved population in the United States was just under 1 million. By 1860, it approached 4 million. That growth was not fueled by ships arriving from Africa. It was driven primarily by births within the enslaved population, combined with the vast internal slave trade that redistributed people from older states to the expanding cotton frontier. Cotton had become the engine pulling this entire system forward. By the middle of the 19th century, it accounted for the majority of American export revenue. British and European textile mills depended heavily on cotton grown by enslaved labor in the American South. The wealth generated by those exports circulated through banks, insurance firms, shipping companies, and international markets. Slavery was not an isolated regional institution. It was entangled with the broader global economy. Inside the United States, the expansion of slavery reshaped political debates with growing intensity. Every new territory admitted to the Union raised the same question: would it permit slavery or prohibit it? Compromises that had once temporarily balanced slave states and free states became increasingly fragile. The Missouri Compromise of 1820 had drawn a line across the continent, attempting to contain slavery's spread. 3 decades later, the Compromise of 1850 attempted again to manage the growing conflict, pairing California's admission as a free state with a strengthened Fugitive Slave Act that forced Northern authorities to assist in returning escaped enslaved people. But each compromise revealed the same underlying tension. The Southern economy had become deeply dependent on slavery's expansion, while abolitionist movements in the North were growing louder and more organized. Newspapers, pamphlets, and speeches increasingly framed slavery as the defining moral and political issue facing the nation. At the center of this debate was the demographic reality that had developed since 1808. The enslaved population had not declined after the Atlantic trade ended. It had expanded dramatically through natural increase. This growth reinforced the plantation economy and strengthened the political power of slaveholding states, which relied on enslaved population counts for representation in Congress under the 3/5 Compromise. As the 1850s progressed, violence and instability began replacing fragile compromise. Armed conflict erupted in Kansas as pro-slavery and anti-slavery settlers fought over the territory's future. Court decisions, such as the 1857 Dred Scott ruling, declared that African Americans, enslaved or free, could not be citizens, and that Congress lacked authority to prohibit slavery in federal territories. Each of these developments pushed the country closer to a breaking point. By the eve of the Civil War, slavery had become more than an institution of labor. It had evolved into a system that shaped land ownership, financial markets, national politics, and the lives of millions of people born into bondage. The internal growth of the enslaved population after 1808 ensured that slavery remained deeply embedded in the American economy for decades. When the conflict finally erupted in 1861, it was not only a war over territory or governance, it was a war over whether the system that had expanded across the 19th century, sustained by the forced labor and births of millions of enslaved people, would continue to define the future of the United States. When the Civil War finally erupted in 1861, the system that had expanded across the first half of the 19th century reached its breaking point. By that time, slavery was no longer simply a labor arrangement confined to plantations. It had become one of the central structures around which the American economy and political order revolved. Millions of enslaved people were producing cotton that powered the global textile industry. Southern wealth was measured in land and human property. Financial institutions extended credit based on the value of enslaved laborers. Political power in Congress had long been shaped by the population counts that slavery itself created. What made this system particularly durable was the transformation that had unfolded after 1808. Once the Atlantic slave trade closed, slavery inside the United States reorganized rather than collapsed. Domestic markets redistributed enslaved people across expanding cotton territories. Births within enslaved communities steadily increased the population. Plantation accounting treated those births as additions to wealth, while law ensured that every child born to an enslaved mother entered the system automatically. By 1860, the enslaved population had grown to nearly 4 million people. Entire generations had lived and died within a structure that reproduced itself without relying on new arrivals from Africa. This demographic growth strengthened the plantation economy, while deepening the political divide between regions that depended on slavery and those that opposed its expansion. When the Civil War began, enslaved people themselves became central to the transformation that followed. As Union armies advanced into Confederate territory, thousands of enslaved men and women fled plantations, seeking protection behind Union lines. Their movement forced the war to confront slavery directly. What had initially been framed by some Northern leaders as a struggle to preserve the Union gradually became a war that also dismantled the institution, sustaining the Confederate economy. In 1863, the Emancipation Proclamation declared enslaved people in Confederate-held territory to be free, shifting the war's political meaning and opening the door for African American men to serve in the Union Army. By the time the conflict ended in 1865, nearly 180,000 black soldiers had fought for the Union, many of them men who had once been enslaved themselves. The 13th Amendment to the United States Constitution formally abolished slavery that same year. Legally, the system that had expanded for generations was dismantled, but the legacy of that expansion did not disappear overnight. 4 million formerly enslaved people emerged from bondage into a nation still struggling to define their rights and status. Families separated through decades of slave sales searched for one another. Communities rebuilt under conditions of economic hardship and political resistance. Reconstruction governments briefly attempted to establish civil and political rights for freed people before the rise of segregationist policies in the late 19th century reshaped the landscape once again. Looking back, the transformation that began with the 1808 ban on the Atlantic slave trade reveals a deeper truth about the institution of slavery in the United States. Closing the overseas trade did not end the system. Instead, it accelerated the development of an internal structure capable of sustaining itself through law, economics, and demographic growth. The plantations, the domestic slave markets, the migration of more than 1 million people across the South, and the millions of births recorded in plantation ledgers all became part of that structure. It was a system that expanded generation after generation until the pressures it created, economic, political, and moral, finally erupted into a national crisis. And by the time the Civil War ended it, the institution had already reshaped the country that had built it.